Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Shubha Kalpataru. It's so nice to see all of you. I want to begin with a bracing remark by Swami Vivekananda. I would say it's a lesser well-known statement of his because it's just a little statement that you find buried in the complete works. He says, let us be true. 9/10 of our life's energy is spent in trying to make people think us that which we are not. That energy would be more rightly spent in becoming that which we would like to be. This is a little bit complicated. I'm going to repeat it again. Let us be true. 9/10 of our life's energy is spent in trying to make people think us that which we are not, putting on a show for others. That energy would be more rightly spent in becoming that which we would like to be. Instead of showing what we are, let's actually try to become what we want other people to think we are. Swami Vivekananda, he was a brilliant psychologist, so he understood that. Deeply rooted in human nature is this tendency toward image consciousness. Concern about one's reputation. What will others think of me in what I'm doing, and so on. And internet, social media, AI, this is not helping. None of these things are helping. They're making the situation worse. These modern phenomena are just exacerbating this innate tendency toward kind of impressing others, desiring recognition, being image conscious, all of that. Now it's because all these social media websites, for instance, are so visually oriented, right? Instagram and so on. And so you put up the best possible, nice, airbrushed, filtered photo of yourself looking supremely happy. It's not real, right? But you want others to think that your life is better than theirs. Social comparison has become this huge problem now because of social media. One of my favorite poets is T.S. Eliot. I did a lot of work on T.S. Eliot when I was younger. And one of his earliest poems is called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And there's some great lines there where he's sketching a scene of people, wealthy people at a cocktail party. And he says in that context, there will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. To prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. That's what most of social life is about. You put on a mask, they put on their mask. You're not a human being meeting another human being. It's just masks, faces. It's that image consciousness. And then you might be thinking, well, yeah, okay, that applies to most people, but we're sitting here because we're spiritual aspirants, we're Vedantans, so that doesn't apply to us. It definitely applies to us. Because there's a tremendous danger of image consciousness in spiritual life. It's a huge danger. And it's not like this is a modern thing. You'll find statements from the earliest scriptures across the world. Let's start with Jesus, because we just celebrated Christmas. He repeatedly warned against image consciousness. Matthew 6, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Then he shifts to prayer. How should we pray to God? And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Notice what he's focusing on here. charity, giving in charity, and prayer, praying to God, both spiritual practices. But there are different ways of doing spiritual practices. We have to be very careful about our motives, the motives behind our spiritual practices. Is the motive purely selfless? Is it purely devotional? Or is it admixed with desire for others to think we're highly spiritual? So this is a huge issue. Spiritual image consciousness is a huge issue. And spirituality itself can become a tremendous source of ego. This is common. I bet many of you know people who are like this, right? And Sri Ramakrishna, interestingly, you'll see all the great saints and avatars, they talk alike. Sri Ramakrishna warned Shambhu Mollik about the same thing, one of his householder devotees. He says, Shambhu said to me, "It is my desire to build a large number of hospitals and dispensaries. Thus I can do much good to the poor." And then Sri Ramakrishna says, "Yes, that's not bad if you can do it in a detached spirit. But to be detached is very difficult unless you sincerely love God. And further, if you entangle yourself in many activities, you will be attached to them in a way unknown to yourself. You may think you have no motive behind your work, but perhaps there's already grown a desire for fame and the advertising of your name." Notice again, he's saying it very specifically. You're doing what is objectively selfless, spiritual, and yet there can be a selfish motive. So we always have to be on our guard. Bhagavad Gita, I'll just mention the verses, I'm not going to go into the details, but chapter 17, verses 20 to 21, distinguishes sattvika charity versus rajasika charity. And we have to be sattvic in all of our activities, even our spiritual practices, even in our charity, because rajasika giving involves, first of all, having a kind of subtle, selfish desire for name and fame, recognition for what I'm doing. Look at how great I am. Look at how generous I am. And there's a subtle desire, at least, if not overt desire, for reciprocity. So it's a kind of quid pro quo. I'm giving you this, but I expect something in return. That's also very rajasic, and that's not the best spiritual motive. Okay. And what about prayer? Just as Jesus warned against prayer being done in public, Sri Ramakrishna says exactly the same thing. He distinguishes different kinds of spiritual aspirants based on the three gunas. He says those endowed with sattva perform their spiritual practices secretly. They look like ordinary people, but they meditate inside the mosquito net. We're thinking of India here. Aspirants endowed with rajas exhibit outward pomp, a string of beads around the neck, a mark on the forehead, an ochre robe, a silk cloth, a rosary with a gold bead, and so on. They are like stall keepers advertising their wares with signboards. He's kind of poking fun at these kind of showy spiritual aspirants. And that's why he would often say, Dhan korbe mone bone okone. He was a great rhymester, so he would rhyme words in Bengali. It's lost in the translation, but it means when you meditate, you should meditate in one of three ways. Either mone, in your own mind, bone, in a corner of a room, or kone, or bone means in a forest, in a secluded forest, or kone means in the corner of a room. What's the common denominator? Not doing him so in such a showy way, right? In the full view of the public. Another one of his teachings in relation to what we're talking about, mon muk ak koro. Mon means mind, and muk, what you say. Try to align them. Try to make them one. Try to align your inner life with your outer life. What you project to the world with what you actually are. You'll find people like Sri Ramakrishna, there's absolutely no difference between inner and outer. Sometimes to the consternation of people, because he was so open about everything. And it's most people, when they become socialized, especially in the West, they get used to kind of cultivating a kind of public persona, which is different from what they really are. And in spiritual life, that's a great danger, this private-public kind of split, bifurcation. So how do we align our inner life with our outer life, right? And one of the biggest problems here in trying to do that is self-deception. I think this is a great danger in spiritual life. We think we're doing things for the right motives. We're very spiritual. Unconsciously, we're doing things with selfish motives, right? So how do we catch ourselves in the act? That's the question. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to present a simple test that we can run on ourselves. Don't run on other people, run on ourselves. To check whether our inner lives are aligned with our outer lives, okay? To test how image conscious we are. Just in general, not just in our spiritual life, but just in general. To test whether we're deceiving ourselves and in what areas of our life are we deceiving ourselves, and so on. Where do we find this test? Well, you'll find versions of this test in different traditions all over the place. Let's start with Plato's Republic. Plato, the founding father of, or one of the founding fathers of Western philosophy. Republic, Book 2. He introduces what he calls the Ring of Gyges, Gyges, okay? And by the way, many of you, I'm sure, have either read J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or seen movies based on Lord of the Rings, but he had studied Plato carefully, and very likely his idea of the ring there was influenced by, at least in part, by Plato's Ring of Gyges, what I'm about to explain. Okay. So what is this Ring of Gyges? Glaucon. So many of you know this, but Plato's dialogues are in the form of dialogues between Socrates and other people. So in this case, Glaucon is the person speaking to Socrates. Glaucon is the one who tells him about this Ring of Gyges. He says, there's once a shepherd boy in a kingdom, very poor, very humble, and he happens upon a magical ring. And when he puts on the ring, what he found is when he just twisted the ring a little, he becomes invisible. Wow, this is interesting. And then he turns it back and then he becomes visible. So notice the parallels with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, right? So what does he do with this ring? Glaucon says, well, not surprisingly, what does he do? First thing he does, he uses the ring to seduce the queen. Now, don't ask me about the logistics about how becoming invisible will help you to seduce somebody. But anyway, he does it. Let's take his word for that. So he seduces the queen, overthrows the king, or kills the king. That's the next step with the power of invisibility, and then seizes the throne. Right? So he uses this ring for his selfish ends. Right? Which, I mean, as a shepherd, before he discovered the ring, he would never have dreamt that he would have done these terrible things, right? The moment he gets that power of invisibility, this is what happens. And by the way, before I go further in analyzing this Ring of Gyges, we might ask people who know something about Indian traditions, are there Indian equivalents? Well, I think there are, and I'll just mention a couple. Valmiki's Ramayana, so the story of Rama. Ravana, the demon Ravana, his son was named Indrajit, Meghanada. And he had the power of invisibility. He got this siddhi, this power, supernormal power. What did he do with it? He used it to kill. He was a warrior, and so he used it to kill many people in battle, which is cowardly, right? Because you're using unethical tactics to kill people. And so it's a kind of the same lesson, the same warning that you find in Plato that you find in Indian texts. Another example, Yoga Sutra 3.21. So you'll find that in Yoga Sutras, Patanjali in Book 3 especially, talks about different supernormal powers, different siddhis. One of them is antardhanam. Antardhanam means the power of invisibility. So you can make yourself invisible, and then immediately the commentators add, be very careful about not just this siddhi, but any siddhi, because it can easily corrupt you. And it can easily make you egoistic, and you can stray from the spiritual path and the spiritual goal. So now, coming back to this Ring of Gyges, imagine that we had this ring and we're wearing the ring and all you have to do is twist it, you become invisible. What would we do with that ring? What would we do with it? How would we live in this world? How would our day-to-day life change if we had this ring? This is a difficult question to ask, but and it's a question to ask ourselves, when we have a moment and when we feel honest with ourselves. Well, Glaucon, so the person speaking to Socrates says, what does this story prove? He says, look, people often pretend that they do good for good's sake, that they actually care about being good. Nobody does. People do good only because they're afraid of being punished for not doing good, for doing bad things. And they do good to preserve a good reputation, to impress others. It's very much outward focused. But nobody does good for good's sake. Goodness, being moral, has no intrinsic value. That's the philosophical term. Being good is only an instrumental value, which means it's a means to an end. What's the end? It's the means to the end of not being punished, getting recognition, and so on. So it's a bit of a cynical view, but we'll see later. I'll mention a few scientific studies that have come out, kind of corroborating the truth of what he's saying to some extent, the empirical truth of what he's saying. Okay. So his point is, in a nutshell, we are less concerned about being good and more concerned about looking good, seeming good to other people. Okay. And we have to ask ourselves to what extent we fall into that same category. Now, how does Socrates respond to Glaucon's challenge? And the Republic is massive. There are many books, and his response comes not in one particular place, but over the course of the rest of the Republic. And what he says is, he introduces this idea of a tripartite soul, okay, that the soul has three dimensions or three aspects. The three aspects are reason, logistikon, spirit, thumos, and three, appetite, epithumia. These three things. So, reason, which is the highest faculty in us, seeks truth, wisdom, guidance, right? Spirit, thumos, this is not spirit in any spiritual sense, but it means courage, honor, righteous indignation, fighting for what's right, that kind of thing. And appetite, epithumia, this is bodily desires, cravings, pleasures, desire for instant gratification, and so on. Okay. So now, Socrates says, we are good, we are just when, among these three parts of the soul, reason rules. So now he's thinking of a kind of metaphor of like a king rulership. When reason rules of the three. Spirit, that sort of fighting for what's right. Spirit supports reason, and appetite obeys reason. So the two other faculties of the soul are subordinated to reason. Reason governs the other two parts of the soul. And what about when you do immoral things? Anytime we do anything immoral, when we do anything bad, there's a disharmony within the soul. Appetite, which is supposed to be obeying reason, overthrows reason and becomes the king, like the shepherd overthrowing the king. Appetite becomes king, overthrowing reason. Spirit sides with appetite rather than reason. So that kind of energy and drive is, instead of being channeled toward good things and moral things, it's being channeled toward satisfying the appetites, lower desires. Okay. And so there's a kind of civil war within the soul where appetite takes over. So now, how does Socrates defeat Glaucon? How does he respond? He says, look, even if I do something bad with nobody watching, let's say I have this ring, so I get away with it with impunity. Let's even add to that and say I'm rewarded for it, externally speaking. Like I get something good. I'm given $1 million to do something really bad. Even then we shouldn't do it. Why? That's the big question. He says, because it harms our soul. Because it creates a disharmony within the soul, which is a recipe for guaranteed unhappiness at the end of the day. This is very interesting. And in fact, again, coming back to Jesus, for what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? That's Mark 8:36. The condition for true happiness is that our soul is in harmony. The different aspects of our soul are in harmony. Anytime we do something bad, regardless of who's watching or not, or whether we're rewarded or not, we suffer. We suffer because the soul gets into disharmony, basically. And then in Phaedrus, another one of the Platonic dialogues, he introduces the metaphor of a chariot to explain the relationship, the interrelation of the three aspects of the soul: reason, spirit, and appetite. He says, imagine that reason is the charioteer. So again, remember that. So he's controlling the chariot, right? Guiding who? There are two horses. There's a good horse and a bad horse, like a good cop and a bad cop. There's a noble horse. This is spirit, thumos. So righteous indignation, courage, strength, honor, and so on. And then there's a bad horse, the unruly horse. That's obviously appetite. right? And so in this metaphor, the idea is that reason needs to govern both these horses in the right way, guide them in the right direction, so that he has control over, and he's holding the reins. So reason is holding the reins on both the horses, making sure that spirit obeys him and that appetite obeys him, and that appetite follows spirit who follows reason, right? So that everything is in, all the different aspects of the soul are in harmony. So now anybody who knows something about Vedanta will probably know that in Vedanta, in the Katha Upanishad, there's the same chariot metaphor with some interesting and subtle but important differences as well. So let's look at the Katha Upanishad metaphor. Well, here, let's look at the similarities first. The same thing. The charioteer is buddhi. The term buddhi really does mean just reason, higher reason, right? So it's the same thing. The reins are the mind. The horses are the senses, the sense organs. The paths that the horses are traversing, sense objects. And so the reason, the charioteer, buddhi, needs to govern the mind in the right way so that the mind can then in turn control the horses, guide the senses in the right direction toward liberation. That's the basic idea. But there's another crucial element in the Vedantic understanding of the chariot that is, as far as I can tell, missing from Socrates' chariot metaphor. Atmanam rathinam vidhi. Atmanam rathinam vidhi. Rathinam. Who is the Rathinam? Rathinam means the lord of the chariot. Imagine when the king travels, he goes in a grand chariot, right? The king is sitting in the chariot. Who is that king? The soul, the Atman. The divine self, the eternal divine self in everyone. That's even greater than the buddhi. In fact, in Indian spiritual philosophies, all of that, the mind, the reason, the senses, they're all insentient. Even reason is insentient. It's all part of the body-mind complex. The soul alone is sentient. The eternal Atman is what lends or what seems to impart consciousness to the reason, the reasoning intellect. So it's the soul that ultimately needs to govern and guide the mind and the intellect and the senses. And when it does, the chariot goes on the path of liberation. When it loses control of the horses, what happens? It's trapped in samsara. It has to keep coming back again and again. So this is what the Katha Upanishad explains. And so the missing element is the Atman, the eternal divine self, which you find in Vedanta. Why is that significant? Well, now let's come to Swamiji. Swamiji, remember, Swami Vivekananda, he was an undergraduate philosophy major at Scottish Church College. He was taught mostly by Western professors. And he was familiar with some of the major Western philosophers of his day, including John Stuart Mill, okay? Very famous philosopher writing on utilitarianism. So a lot of these philosophers were concerned with what's considered a meta-ethical question, which is, why should we be good? This is a fundamental question. Why? And John Stuart Mill says, well, because it increases utility, meaning benefit to ourselves and to others, something like that. Swamiji didn't find that response very convincing. And so he says, this is in a lecture called The Claims of Religion, 1896. He says, there are attempts at producing a system of ethics from mere grounds of utility. He's thinking of Mill, he's thinking of Bentham, and so on. I challenge any person to produce such a rational system of ethics. Do good to others. Why? Because it's the highest utility. Suppose a person says, I don't care for utility. I want to cut the throats of others and make myself rich. What will you answer? It is out-Heroding Herod. But where is the utility of my doing good to the world? Am I a fool to work my life out that others may be happy? Why shall I myself not be happy if there's no other sentiency beyond society, no other power in the universe beyond the five senses? What prevents me from cutting the throats of my brothers, so long as I can make myself safe from the police and make myself happy? This is the Ring of Gaiji's challenge again, isn't it? In his own form, in his own way. What will you answer? You are bound to show some utility. When you are pushed from your ground, you answer, my friend, it is good to be good. What is the power in the human mind which says it is good to do good, which unfolds before us in glorious view the grandeur of the soul, the beauty of goodness, the all-attractive power of goodness, the infinite power of goodness? That is what we call God, is it not? What's Swamiji doing? What's he saying here? ultimately the only real justification for being good and doing good, being ethical, has to be spiritual. It has to have a transcendental ground, either God or a higher self. But you cannot ground ethics in reason alone. By reason alone, it's always more rational to do what's going to benefit you even at the expense of others. That's the problem. Well, at least some people will arrive at that calculus. But if ultimately we are eternal divine souls, right? Then, so we'll see, how does Swamiji respond to this Glaucon's challenge, the Ring of Gaiji's challenge? It has two aspects. The first is very similar to what Socrates says. So just as Socrates says, even if nobody's watching, you're not punished for the bad thing you're doing. Your soul will be in disharmony and you'll suffer for it. Swamiji says exactly the same thing. When there's a disharmony within the soul, you're going to suffer, regardless of how much you're rewarded externally and whether you can get away with it or not. Okay, but at the same time, he adds that fundamentally we are eternal divine souls, Atman, separate from the body-mind complex. And so he's giving a kind of metaphysical explanation as to why a disharmonious soul is ultimately the root of unhappiness. The more we identify with the body-mind complex, the more we suffer. And the more we're able to identify with the deeper divine soul within, the happier we become, because that soul is Satchitananda. It's the essence of bliss. So the more we tap into that soul, the more we identify with that soul, the more blissful we become. So this is the missing element from Socrates. And then Swamiji will add as a Vedantin another element, which is not found in Republic at all, in Socrates' reasoning, which is the doctrine of karma. Even if not a single person in this world sees what we're doing, knows what we're doing, and even let's say that we get rewarded for it externally, we still have to suffer the karmic consequences for what we do. Nobody escapes the law of karma, which means what? We do something bad, we're going to have to pay for it sometime in the future, either later in this life or in a future life. Nobody gets away scot-free. Okay. So then you may wonder, well, some people seem to get away scot-free. Yeah, but that's only because you're seeing this lifetime. And there are people who will only really be punished for it in between lifetimes or in the next lifetime. So Swamiji himself sums up his approach to ethics, the Vedantic approach to ethics, in another lecture called The Necessity of Religion. He says, why should we do good? Doing good is a secondary consideration. We must have an ideal. Ethics itself is not the end. This might be startling to Western ears, but ethics itself is not the end, but the means to the end. Well, then what's the end? If the end is not there, why should we be ethical? Why should I do good to other men and not injure them? If happiness is the goal of mankind, why should I not make myself happy and others unhappy? What prevents me? It has to be a means to the end of something spiritual, the spiritual goal of realizing our true divine nature. Only then do we get a proper rationale for doing good in this world. What do we find in the Gita? Chapter 18, Bhagavan Krishna distinguishes two kinds of happiness, sukham. Again, based on the three gunas. He distinguishes three kinds of, but I'm only going to discuss two kinds of happiness here. Rajasika happiness, and I've talked about a lot in previous talks here, I'm sure. So, Vishayendriya sanyogad yattad agre mirtopamam pariname vishmeva tatsukham rajasamspadam, which means this is any happiness based on instant gratification. Anything based on the contact of sense organs with the sense object is a Rajasika form of happiness. And they all have the same structure. What's that structure? In the beginning, it's like nectar. Wow, there's nothing like it. In the end, it becomes like poison. Every single instant gratification has a structure. The stronger the pleasure, the worse it feels at the end. The worse the poison, the stronger the poison. And then Krishna says, by contrast, sattvika forms of joy have exactly the opposite structure. Yattad agre vishimiva. They feel like poison in the beginning. Very unpleasant. I don't like doing this. But in the end, they become like nectar. And Krishna gives a beautiful explanation as to why, a very deep metaphysical answer, as to why sattvika forms of joy ultimately become like nectar. Atma buddhi prasadajam. Because sattvika forms of happiness are based on the gratification, prasada, of Atma and Buddhi, of the higher reason, the reason that Socrates talks about, the Buddhi in the Kathopanishad metaphor, and also the gratification of the soul within us, the Atma. Atma Buddhi Prasadajam. Anything we do that helps us to identify with the deeper divine soul within, that makes the soul happy, that gratifies the deeper soul within, is ultimately going to make us happy in the long run. And anything that strengthens our false identification with the body-mind complex, so all the different forms of instant gratification, are going to make us more and more miserable. That's the idea that we find also in the Bhagavad Gita. So how do we apply these, what seem to be maybe abstract philosophical ideas, to our spiritual life? That's the last part of this talk. I want to suggest two very practical tests. One I call the Gaiji's test. The other we can call it by different names, something like the reverse Gaiji's test, or also I'll explain that we can also call it the Truman Show test. If any of you have seen the movie The Truman Show. Okay, so let's start with the Gaiji's test. Imagine you have this ring of Gaijis. So you have the power of invisibility. What will we do with it? Each of us needs to ask ourselves that. How would our behavior change if we owned the ring of Gaijis and we can use it at any time and do whatever we wanted with impunity? Hard, tough questions, but these are questions that we need to ask ourselves as spiritual aspirants. Now, once we determine where the shoe pinches, I mean, it might be that, yeah, I'll be the same in my parenting, I'll be the same in my work life, but, well, there's this area where I need to work on because this is where I feel like I'll be going in the wrong direction. What does that mean? It means that's a growth area. It's not meant, you're not supposed to beat yourself up about this. The idea is, this is a really useful way to identify weak points in your spiritual life, growth areas in your spiritual life. These are things I need to work on, right? It's a really helpful way to pinpoint exactly what I need to work on in my spiritual life. And honestly, if we're honest with ourselves, we'll have to admit that in some respects we fall short, that in some respects we'll do something not really dignified, maybe not aligned with our best nature, our highest self, if we have this ring of invisibility. And there are empirical scientific studies backing this up. I'll just mention a couple. This is from a study by Melissa Bateson et al., published in Biology Letters in 2006. The title of the article is Cues of Being Watched Enhance Cooperation in a Real-World Setting. It's really interesting, this experiment. She works at a university. There's a coffee room. And it's based on the honor system. So there's coffee, there's whatever, and they ask for a donation. On the donation box, they have two variations. One is they put a pair of eyes on the donation box. And then in other variations, instead of a pair of eyes, they put just kind of generic flowers, a kind of flower design. And they want to see how much people donate. What they found astonishingly is that when there's a pair of eyes, like just cut out of articles, magazine articles or something, looking at you, people are far more likely to make a donation and a more generous donation than when there's just generic flowers. They'll just take the coffee and run without paying for it. What does that mean? Unconsciously. It's not like they're consciously doing it. And what is a magazine pair of eyes anyway? They're not real eyes. Nobody's actually watching. There's no camera rolling. The very fact that there's a pair of eyes just looking at you makes them more good, which seems to reinforce Glaucon's claim, at least empirically speaking, that most people tend to act good, do good things in order to impress others and in order not to receive punishment. Another example along the same lines. This is a study done by C. Daniel Batson. The article is called Moral Masquerades, Experimental Exploration of the Nature of Moral Motivation. And here, it's very complex, and I'm just going to mention one aspect of it, which is that he does a kind of similar test, but the variation is he puts a full-length mirror in the room and checks whether the person will still engage in an unethical behavior or not with the mirror there. And what he found is when there's a mirror there, people are much less likely to engage in the unethical activity. When they just see themselves doing that bad thing, they're less likely to do it. Isn't that interesting? That's why I called this talk The Mirror of the Soul in the Eyes of God. When we feel the deeper divine soul within, when we know that that's there, when we're not just the body-mind complex, we'll be much less inclined to do bad things. When we know that even if the entire world is asleep and doesn't see what we're doing, but we know that God, as Antaryami, as the inner controller within, sees what we're doing, then our conscience pricks us and we say, okay, I don't want to offer this to God. the mirror of the soul in the eyes of God. In our tradition, Sri Ramakrishna gave us a very concrete Gaiji's test, which again, this is more of a deep cut. This is not found in the gospel. You'll find this in Brahmanandaji's compilation of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, Sri Ramakrishna Upadesh, number 50, or page 50, I guess. So anyway, I'm going to just read the translation. This is my own translation. In a secluded place with nobody watching. He's thinking of a heterosexual male. Okay, just keep that in mind. In a secluded place with no one watching. If a man sees a beautiful young woman, and instead of approaching her with the feeling of lust, sees her as a manifestation of Divine Mother and goes away, that person can be called a true renunciate. By contrast, the person who dresses outwardly like a renunciate in public, look at me, I'm a great renunciate, that person cannot be called a true renunciate. Prakritotagi, like a really natural renunciate. There are some monks in our order who are like our guru, Swahanandaji. You meet him and you feel that he just exudes purity and renunciation, that he was meant to be, he was born to be a monk. There's something very natural in his renunciation. There's no outward show. And there are others where you feel like they're very image conscious, or it's more difficult for them to actually, they might fail that Gaiji's test. So Sri Ramakrishna gives us his Gaiji's test very clearly. That's just one example. But so these are difficult questions, but we have to ask ourselves, and it doesn't apply to just that situation, but whatever temptation that we have in spiritual life. Would we behave the same way if we can get away with it, if we knew we could get away with it? Again, in the gospel, we find again and again that Sri Ramakrishna would warn about the 8 fetters. And one of the 8 fetters in spiritual life is secretiveness, gopanadicha, doing things in secret. So ask yourself, what are the things that I do in secret that I wouldn't be so proud of if other people were watching? There's a bit of a scandal a few months ago because there's a CEO of a company who was having an affair or something like an affair, and he went to like a Coldplay concert, and then they were caught on the kiss cam. They just happened to be on the kiss cam, like in some kind of intimate moment, and they both got, the way they reacted was so obviously like they were caught, they were busted, that the main singer, I forgot his name, Chris Martin, that he made a joke about it and says either they're having an affair or there's something or other, and then it became front page news, and it was a whole, it was very humiliating. So the point is not to shame anybody, but it's just people, that's human nature, is that if they can get away with it, often people will try to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise, right? And in fact, that was one of the things I really liked when I first moved to India to become a monk, right after my PhD in 2009, I moved to India, and because I grew up in Boston, and I lived in India for 13 years. And one of the first things that struck me is that there's far less of an emphasis on privacy, like having a private life separate from one's public life. That's a very Western thing, I found. And in fact, the only thing that's really private is their spiritual life. That's the thing that they keep private. But so Swami Ranganathanji, who is one of our former presidents, one of the great Swamis of our order, he would joke, after having visited the West and then coming back to India, he would say, and by the way, the word micturate, he uses the word micturate, which means urinate. So he says, in the West, people micturate in private and eat in public. And in India, people micturate in public and eat in private. You follow that? So it's like what counts as private in different cultures is very, it's very interesting. I joined at Vivekananda University in Belur Math, and I was walking in the South Indian bus, and everybody's doors were open. And I just found that really odd, because in the West, everybody has their doors closed, and it's like, they don't want people to know what they're doing behind the closed doors. So I like that. It's something that it struck me. Yoganandaji, one of the great monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, he subjected Sri Ramakrishna himself to a Gaiji's test. You guys probably know about this. So when he first started meeting Sri Ramakrishna, he was a little puzzled by the fact that his great renunciate is married, and his wife is just down the block. And he's like, well, what's going on here? What kind of renunciate is this? And so he's staying with Sri Ramakrishna one night in his room, and then he wakes up in the middle of the night and notices Sri Ramakrishna is not in his bed. So then this doubt comes into his mind. Maybe he's going to visit his wife. And so he goes outside, kind of looks around to see where Sri Ramakrishna is, does some independent investigating. Sri Ramakrishna, meanwhile, he went to go to answer the call of nature in the woods. And as he's coming back, he sees Yoganandaji. Yoganandaji is mortified and feels terrible that he was questioning his guru's purity. And Sri Ramakrishna immediately, without having said a word, he understood the situation. He said, well, you're quite right. You must examine a sadhu by day and by night before believing in him. Notice, before believing in him. Subject your guru to all sorts of tests before he becomes your guru. You have to be very careful in discerning. There are certain people who are more susceptible to falling into like cults. These are people who don't do their homework beforehand. So observe that person by day and by night before you accept them as your spiritual teacher, your guru. Once you do, surrender. So now, that's one important test. Another one. Let's reverse this, the Gaiji's test. And I call this the reverse Gaiji's test or the Truman Show test. I rewatched Truman Show recently just to prep for this. It's a nice little movie. Imagine a Truman Show scenario where you're being observed at all times. How would your behavior change? It's interesting. It's just kind of the reverse of this Gaiji's test. How would you behave differently? Would you wake up earlier? Would you sit longer for meditation? Would you not yell at your kids? Would you be more polite with your coworkers? I mean, there are a million things, right? Would you not swear during rush hour traffic? Interesting. Let's ask ourselves that question. And again, I think just like with the Gaiji's test, we're all going to fail in some respects. And it helps to know exactly where we fall short. And what does it mean? How would we behave differently if we knew we were being watched? That's where the shoe pinches. That's what we need to work on in our spiritual life. So some practical tips. Number one, let's run the Gaiji's test on ourselves and the Truman Show on ourselves to help us pinpoint aspects of our spiritual life that need some improvement, some growth areas. Second, in terms of our spiritual practices, let's always be on our guard and be careful about doing them as quietly as possible, not so much in the public eye. It's very important and something that we often forget. And especially these days, everything is Instagrammable and this and that. And so you get a great, you ask somebody to take a picture of you in lotus pose and then you post that and you're looking for how many likes you get and retweets or whatever. No, we're going down the wrong path when we do that. So you have to be really careful about that, especially in this day and age. Let's try to be spiritual instead of just trying to seem spiritual. Okay, that's in a nutshell. Another thing, I keep talking about the three gunas. How is that relevant? Well, you'll notice, from the Bhagavad Gita, you'll notice from Jesus, who doesn't talk about the three gunas, but the same idea. You'll notice from Sri Ramakrishna's teachings and the teachings of many great saints. The more sattvic you are, automatically the less image conscious you are. It's automatic. You don't have to work at it. If you're very, very sattvic, just ask yourself, who's the most sattvic person I've met in my life? You're going to find they don't care what other people think of them. They do things because they think it's right. Not because they're going to be rewarded for it, people are watching, or that I can get away with it. Nothing like that. There's perfect harmony between inner and outer, between a perfectly sattvic person. So the practical tip is, let's try to become as sattvic as possible in every aspect of our lives. So it's kind of indirect way to guarantee that we won't be so image conscious. And I give a separate talk, I think long back probably, on the three gunas in spiritual life. How do we make our relationships with others as sattvic as possible? Just some examples. With our spouse or with our partner. How do we do that? Most people have a kind of more rajasic kind of relationship or a tamasic relationship. A tamasic relationship with your partner is a negligent one. We kind of neglect each other. We don't love each other. There's that kind of... Rajasic is extreme, unhealthy codependence. I depend on her, she depends on me, and we can't live without each other, and it's very suffocating, and there's a lot of emotional drama and highs and lows, and I love you, I hate you. Rajasic. Sattvic. You're spiritual partners. You're side by side rather than face to face, and you're helping each other on your respective spiritual journeys. You love each other, but without the clinging and without the unhealthy codependence and the attachment. So that's more sattvic. Make your relationships more sattvic. Make your relationship with your children more sattvic if you're a parent. How do you do that? Try to avoid helicopter parenting, which is more rajasic. Let them grow in their own way. That's more sattvic. In rush hour traffic, what kind of music are you listening to? Is it very rajasic, which is very worldly kind of lyrics? And are you being very rajasic when you're in rush hour traffic, flipping the bird at other drivers and just cursing and this and that? Or there's a way to be sattvic while being stuck in rush hour traffic. Listen to spiritual music. Listen to Krishna Das. Listen to beautiful bhajans. Listen to beautiful Christian spiritual music, whatever it is, whatever you like. Something spiritually uplifting. Do japa, for goodness sakes, when you're stuck in traffic. What a wonderful thing. It's a great opportunity for spiritual practice. If you just change your attitude, being stuck in traffic for an hour and a half becomes an opportunity to do 1.5 hours of japa. That's a more sattvic approach, right? And the more sattvic we become, the less image conscious we'll be automatically. And I wanted to end with a really remarkable verse from a pretty obscure scripture. I bet most of you have never heard of this. The scripture you might have heard of, but the scripture is called Manusmriti. And the verse is 8.85. Manyante vai papakrito nakaschit pashyatiti naha tamstu devaha prapashyanti swasyevantara purushaha. Sinners indeed, papakritaha, think nobody sees us. And then Manu says, but God sees them, and also their own higher self sees them. These two things are always there. The mirror of the soul and the eyes of God. Remember those two social science experiments. When a mirror was placed in the room, we're less likely to do unethical things. When there are eyes watching us, we're more likely to pay for the coffee. Interesting, right? So let's always try to make our every thought and our every action a worthy offering to the divine. And let's always try to live up to our highest ideals, even or especially when no one's watching. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Parnamastu.
Any questions?
Okay. Oh, okay. We'll do that now. Is there water somewhere? No. Okay. Anyway, we'll get it later. That's okay. Don't worry about it. I'll just get it outside. It's no problem.
If you have questions, raise your hand.
Questions? This is a heavy duty talk.
I have one.
You're all struck dumb. Yeah.
Check.
Oh, not. I'm not hearing it.
No.
Yeah. Oh, I think that one's working. The other one.
Check.
That one looks like it's no.
Check.
No.
Okay. Well, I have a loud voice.
You got a loud voice, and I'll try to repeat the question. Yeah.
So, I've studied Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj and the Gita, and I found something interesting that recently has been puzzling to me. When Arjuna asked Krishna to show him my form, and it was terrifying to him. Nisargadatta also says to some of his disciples, this is going to be painful and ugly while you get there. So what is that they're talking about? And how do we transcend that if we get there spiritually, where it becomes chaotic and maybe scary at times?
Yeah, I call it something like a churning. I think every sincere spiritual aspirant has to go through a kind of period of karmic churning, where all sorts of unpleasant aspects of our personality come up. Not to make us miserable, that's not the purpose. The purpose is to make us aware of where the shoe pinches, basically. Every single one of them, honest self-awareness is just a really important aspect of spiritual life. And it's painful because most of us are not even honest with ourselves. And so it's not pleasant, but it's necessary. That's my feeling about this.
Does it have to do with this test too, in a sense?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
That's why I brought it up. Is like, how does that relate to these tests when we test ourselves in these ways? Is that what we're seeing, that kind of ugly, scary?
The tests, when we undergo that test, we're literally going through the churning process, basically. Like we're allowing things to come up that we usually hide from ourselves, let alone others. Right? That's the beauty of these tests. They're not meant to be applied to other people. We apply them to ourselves. Right? And even Holy Mother, when people would tell her that, the moment I'm fine, more or less, the mind's okay, but then the moment I sit to meditate, all sorts of terrible thoughts come to my mind. She says, and she explains it as a kind of churning. Like the stuff will come up, but that's a good sign because then it comes to the light of awareness, the light of consciousness, and then you can dissolve it by channeling those energies toward God. That's the idea. And so there's an unpleasant period in everyone's spiritual life, if you're being sincere, when you have to become aware of aspects of your own personality, your own self, that you normally hide even from yourself. That's how I see it. Yeah, other questions? Yeah, Gita?
Well,
Now the mic is working.
in response to that,
Mm-hmm.
isn't it Krishna just showing himself mostly?
Mm-hmm.
Why would people be afraid of that?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, actually I forgot to talk about the actual, so you're referring to chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, which is called Vishvarupa Darshana Yoga, which means this is where Krishna is revealing to Arjuna his Vishvarupa Darshana. That's Krishna, the divine, in the form of everything in this universe. Okay, that's a very specific kind of vision. Okay, and it was terrifying to Arjuna. Now, what that reminds me of recently, because I gave a talk a couple of days ago on January 1st on Kalpataru Day. In our tradition, that's celebrated for a different reason, which is that Sri Ramakrishna, on January 1st, 1886, he blessed a number of people. He became a Kalpataru, which means a wish-fulfilling tree. And one of the people he blessed was Boykuntanath Shunnal. And Shunnal, the moment he touched him, Shunnal went into this ecstatic state where he saw everything. He saw the form of Sri Ramakrishna everywhere and in everything. Literally, I'm talking to you now, I'm seeing the form of Sri Ramakrishna in each of you. I'm seeing the form of Sri Ramakrishna in the chairs. I'm seeing the form of Sri Ramakrishna in the microphone and so on. That was his experience. And it was continuous and it was making him crazy. And then he's like, I've got a family. I've got to go to work. I can't just see Sri Ramakrishna everywhere. My coworkers are Sri Ramakrishna. My wife is Sri Ramakrishna. My kids are Sri Ramakrishna. And so he prays to Sri Ramakrishna to take away this vision. And then immediately he doesn't see that anymore. But he also adds, by the grace of Sri Ramakrishna, he continued to see once in a while, like twice a day or something, the form of Sri Ramakrishna everywhere, but it was more manageable. And then he also said, why was I so dumb? Why did I pray for this experience to be diminished, to be lessened? Because he's like, what's the worst that can happen? I'll go crazy or I'll die. But let it be for the sake of God. So, but anyway, so I think that's a good example of why, if you're not ready, spiritually speaking, if you're not pure enough to get that vision, then that's what happens. You get this reaction from within. You even forget about that. What about Swami Vivekananda himself? The second visit to Sri Ramakrishna. And Sri Ramakrishna touches him on the chest and he sees the entire world kind of dissolving away and the trees and everything flying away. And he starts shouting, what about my parents? What will happen to them? Ah! And then Sri Ramakrishna says, okay, all in good time. And he touches him again. And then he brings him back to normal consciousness. So forget about even ordinary people. Look at Swami Vivekananda, right? Yeah.
And then actually my question was about Buddhi.
Buddhi, yeah, be careful with that word. Yeah.
I think that the translation is intellect, as far as my understanding of intellect.
Mm-hmm.
Seems very limiting.
Mm-hmm. So what would be a better translation?
I don't know, I'm not sure. I think of the pure Buddhi as being in tune with the divine
Yeah.
mind, let's
Yeah.
say.
Mm-hmm.
But intellect, and especially logic and reasoning, doesn't seem all necessarily pure and high and spiritual.
It need not be, but it depends on how pure the mind is, right? One of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings is the pure mind, the pure buddhi, and the pure atman are one and the same, right? So now he's just thinking of mind and buddhi in the ordinary sense, except that the difference is, for most of us, we have impure minds and impure buddhis. When we make them pure through spiritual practice, then it becomes one with the atman. What's the idea? Swami Vivekananda really emphasized this. He says, see, the purpose of the goal of any of these yogas is not to give us spiritual knowledge, to give us knowledge of Brahman. We're already Brahmagyanis. We already have that knowledge of Brahman within us. But there are these layers of impurity, these veils covering over that innate knowledge that we have. Through spiritual practice, we remove those veils. And then that innate knowledge manifests, right? It shines forth. It shines radiantly. So that's the idea, I think.
I question is there another English word that we could use?
Reason, intellect.
But I think when they talk about pure buddhi, like also there's in the heart, there's the heart called hridaya, right? So I think when this becomes awakened, when you talk about buddhi and when you talk about a heart, you're using buddhi as a way of you're saying like reasoning. Heart is a way of feeling. Is this right or wrong? You can feel it or you can think it, right? But they become one. My understanding, really. So there's this, we're using buddhi as this aspect, pure buddhi, pure heart, what is this awakening? So it's just, I think it's the way you come at it, right? Here you're using the term like in terms of reasoning. So the pure heart also is that awakened that feels, is this right, is this wrong, is this good, is this bad? I can feel my way. Depending on how you, I think, what operates most for you. Understand?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think they're one and the same in that sense.
Yeah, that's a nice point. So like me, a pure buddhi, you're saying, Maharaj, is more aligned with the heart, maybe?
Yeah.
Something like that? Yeah. Actually, yeah, Ramanuja, interestingly, I don't know if you know, but when he's analyzing the 5 Atmas in the Taittiriya Upanishad, the Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya, usually most commentators will interpret the Vijnanamaya as the intellect, right? Reasoning and whatever. Ramanuja interprets the Vijnanamaya Atma as the eternal Jivatman, the individual soul. And that's in the heart center, according to Sri Ramakrishna, right? In that heart chakra. So that kind of aligns with what Hari Ramanaji is saying. Yes, other questions? Yeah. Can we get the mic over there, even if it's not working? Just for show.
My name is Ronan. I've
Hi.
been studying Vedanta for the past couple
Can you bring it a little closer? There we go.
I'm here from San Diego and I've
Okay.
been studying Vedanta for the past couple months.
Yeah.
And I've heard the phrase from Swami, sort of Medhananda, of covering everything with God so that you can uncover God. And so in my life, I've had very few moments where like that has been like I've seen or I've felt that, but then most other moments it's having dualism. How is that? How does one, I guess, have that be a constant stream in their life? It's always like maybe tips on like remembering that in one's life.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very good practical question. I think the simplest way to answer it is to say you'll find in the Bhagavad Gita this idea of being satata yukta, which means always try to remain connected with the divine under all circumstances. Link whatever you're doing to the divine in some way. That's why before every meal we do Brahmarpana, we recite a verse of the Gita. What's the idea? Is that we're offering the food that we're about to eat to the divine, and we're thanking the divine. But even in contexts where we're extremely busy, either raising our kids or going to work or this or that, try to connect it with the divine in some way. So with your work, for instance, try to make it karma yoga. How do you do that? Try to remove the selfish motives. Right before you start your work, think of God and offer what you're about to do mentally to God. In the midst of the work, once in a while, try to check in with God. At the end of the work, at the end of a work day, offer what you've just done that whole day to the divine. Yat karoshi yadashnasi yadjuhoshi dadasiyat yat pasikante tatkurushmadaparam. Chapter 9 of the Gita. Whatever you do, do it as an offering to Krishna, to God. Okay, that's one aspect of it. Sri Ramakrishna would often teach Shorboda Shoron Monan, Sarvada Smarana Manana, which means just think of God as much as you can. Okay. And I'm reading right now a beautiful Bengali text, Sri Ramakrishna Je Rupe Dekhiyechi. So it's reminiscence of Sri Ramakrishna by his direct disciples. And Swami Ramakrishnaji says something beautiful. He says, Sri Ramakrishna would never say, he was not a dry type, and he wouldn't say, don't do X, Y, or Z. He wouldn't say, you're wrong for doing this. He would say, oh, you want to enjoy that? Go ahead and do it. But always remember that it's Divine Mother who's giving you that opportunity to engage in that enjoyment. It's very interesting. And there's an incident that reflects that. Girish Ghosh was a famous libertine and an alcoholic and would visit brothels even though he was married and so on and so forth, all sorts of things. But he had a number of tremendous qualities. And so one of them was he was extremely honest. So he was open. He didn't hide anything. So he would pass the Gaijis test. He was like, What you see is what you get, right? But he comes to Sri Ramakrishna one day, dead drunk, and is kind of just in despair. He looks at Sri Ramakrishna and says, how do I kick this habit? This is ruining my life. And Sri Ramakrishna says, just relax, don't worry about it. Next time you have a desire to drink, offer that bottle to Divine Mother first. And he did it. He's like, wait, is it that easy? All right, I'll just keep drinking then. So before drinking the next time, he offers it to Divine Mother. He maybe drinks a few times, but eventually what happens? He feels guilty. He doesn't want to offer that drink to Divine Mother anymore. So that's what happens. It's a kind of miracle. That's the magic that happens. The moment you connect anything you're doing, whatever activity, whatever thought you're thinking, to the divine, it gets purified. Thank you. It's a good question.